Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Science Facts and Fallacies, episode 210. 210, Kevin. That's ridiculous. My name's Cameron English. I'm your host, as always. Kevin Folta, your other host, co-host, whatever you want to call him. It doesn't matter. We're just two dudes talking about science. Kevin, what's up?
Yeah, it looked like it's always funny when I see myself on this because it depends on when we record. And today I was out working, worked all day in the office and then got home from work and went out and did work. And now it's late and I'm, kind of trying to recover from planting trees, trying to get them in because we're getting a very rare rainstorm tomorrow. So I had to get these things in the ground. So very exciting.
That's crazy, man. I don't know how you're going to do it when John Travolta shows up because she's not going to care. Yeah. She won't care that you got trees to plant. She's just going to be like, I want a bottle and I'm going to scream until you give it to me. It's fun. You'll love it.
That's why we're going to be breastfeeding. It kind of lets me off the hook a little bit.
Well,
because all I have is nipples of disappointment. The baby latches on one time and says, screw this.
This sounds like a punk band.
Not only is there no milk, they taste funny.
Oh, no. That's the worst. That's the worst combination. All right. I told you guys last week, the dad jokes are back. They're back. We can't keep them away. All right. So 3 stories to discuss this week, as usual. First up, 99.8% rebuffing environmental working groups' dirty dozen pesticide claims. EPA says almost all fruits and vegetables are safe. And next, how the war in Ukraine has derailed Europe's farm to fork initiative and sparked a debate about what constitutes sustainable agriculture. And finally, concerned about pesticides in the environment, let's talk to some hands-on experts and ignore the ideologues. Always great advice, Kevin, I find, but let's go back up, talk about EWG. It's the time of year when they put out that ridiculous report and they try to scare moms about pesticides. So tell us a little bit more.
Well, and it works, right? Because it's on CNN and it's on MSNBC and it's on every news channel, and it gets incredible traction where all of a sudden everything that you really like eating that's healthy for you to eat and good for you to enjoy now is going to kill you. According to the EWG, there are the dirty dozen, right? These are fruits and vegetables, mostly fruits, that have detected levels of pesticides. And the article that was written really talked about the EPA standards, and that the EPA standards tell us that what we have for food supply is remarkably safe. And the article itself says that talks about the different levels at which EPA looks at and considers these minimum residue levels. They go through, most importantly, the USDA's pesticide data program. And what this is a program where the USDA will evaluate randomly or systematically fruits from all over the country and determine how much pesticide residue is there. And the idea is to confirm that farmers are, in fact, using it safely. And it really is just more than anything else, a way to demonstrate that to build trust in the food that we're consuming. And the bottom line is that the USDA and EPA say the numbers are good. And it says that 98% of stuff or 98.5% or 99% of the stuff annually comes in well below the acceptable residue levels. That's really good news. And what that says is that we can detect very little of something in the area of parts per billion, parts per trillion, and that these are molecules that are barely there. Yet they're being described as a risk, something that's potentially unsafe. At least that's the implication from Environmental Working Group. And so what they do in EWG is they disingenuously manipulate statistics. And they take the real USDA data. They don't do their own testing. They take the USDA data and they say, okay, in Washington State there, we found a fungicide on strawberries. And then in Maine, they found an insecticide on strawberry at maybe 4 parts per billion, right? 4 seconds in 32 years. And then in strawberry, they found an herbicide on strawberries 6 months later. And it's barely there. They then say strawberries are loaded with this stuff. There's 3 different pesticides that we've identified on strawberries. Now, they weren't identified on one strawberry or in one place or at one time. Yet they compile all these data and don't say how much. They really say detected in order to say, and you'll see in their articles, they'll say we've detected 53 different pesticides on strawberries. Well, yeah, that's right. They've detected 53. It doesn't mean that one has 53 kinds. And that's the one way that they blow this out of order. The other way is by making up thresholds. And the times they do use quantitative data is that they'll say, well, our data show that they're over the acceptable thresholds. They ignore the US EPAs. They ignore the more stringent ones, international or California sometimes is more stringent ones. They ignore those, but they make up their own. So it's kind of like sticking an arrow in the side of a barn and then drawing a bullseye around it and saying, hey, look, we got it, right? I mean, that's exactly what they do. So it's really kind of, it really is manipulation. It's disingenuous. And then the worst part is that it qualifies as disinformation because the folks at EWG are pretty sharp. I've talked to them. I've had lunch with them. I've met them in different occasions in different places. And I was very impressed by how smart they were and how much of a good handle they had on the science. These are not dumb people, but they are masters of scaring the hell out of you to push their agenda. So enjoy your fruits and vegetables, folks, especially if you buy them from us.
Exotics has everything you need. Yeah, there's so much to say. I don't want to dwell too much. I know they have a toxicologist on staff, or at least they did a couple of years ago. So if she has any memory whatsoever of her education, she knows that what they're doing is disingenuous. She just has to because she knows everything we're talking about. A couple other things that we can stress. As you said, there's multiple agencies looking at this. So the EPA does very thorough testing of every pesticide it registers. And then it's up to the USDA to look at the raw agricultural commodities that are treated with pesticides. And then the FDA looks at the finished products that you get in grocery stores. So you have agencies. And by the way, these agencies compete for money and they compete for influence in the regulatory space. So they don't have any incentive to complement each other. So the fact that they're all looking at this to one degree or another, and they all agree it is important. And in some ways, it's something of a consensus. It doesn't mean you have to trust everything they say, or, I don't have any affiliation with FDA or anything, but you have multiple agencies looking at this, and that is significant. And then when it comes to, and Kevin, you can speak to this, when it comes to EPA doing the testing that it does, they figure out at what dose you can kill an animal, usually a rodent, with a particular pesticide. And then they set it like 10 or 100 times, maybe 1,000 times lower. And then that's the level that farmers are allowed to use. And excuse me, let me clarify. It's not the level that kills the animal. It's the level that actually registers a biological effect. So once they hit that, they go, okay, 100 times lower than that, just as a safety threshold. And then they go out and they do field trials with farmers and they say, okay, how much can you spray before you get to this limit that we've set? And then that is what's legally enforced by the EPA. So this is no joke. This is really, really in-depth testing. And again, it's enforceable under federal law. So that's a big deal. And then one other thing I want to say before I quit talking, what EWG and these other groups do, as you said, is that they'll just take some standard they invent. So what they do is they will propose legislation, and then it gets into Congress, and they go, we have this bill pending in Congress, and this would set a ridiculously absurd standard that nobody with any expertise actually thinks is legitimate. And then we're going to tell the public that this is the standard that the EPA isn't following because, insert your conspiracy theory here. Or the other one they'll do, and they do this with heavy metals in baby food and all sorts of other chemicals, is they say, this is above the standard that EWG experts believe protective of children's health. Now, what does that mean, And again, Kevin's soon to be dad. I'm a dad. I want to protect my kid. I don't want him to get sick or poisoned or what have you. So to say that something isn't protective is a very nebulous, loosey-goosey standard. It basically means whatever they want it to mean. Hence the, the bullseye around the arrow and the bond and so forth. So we can keep going on, but anything else to say about that?
No, that you pretty much summarized it all. It's one of these things that I hope that people, when they see this in social media, identify the good sources of information. Use the hashtags No Dirty Dozen. Use Safe Fruits and Veggies. Make sure that you are spreading the good information that as you see it, because the Dirty Dozen penetrates everywhere, and it's deceptive. It harms the poor the most, because people who don't have a choice, either because they live in a food desert or because they choose to not afford organic produce that they get scared into, it's been shown that it changes consumer behaviors. So this hurts the poor, it hurts the farmers, it hurts public perception of chemistry. It does no good service other than to EWG. And I think it's a great way for them to raise money. Can't blame them for doing it every year, but it's unethical. And I think we all need to be pushing back.
Yep, get the news out there, get the good information out there, because it makes a difference. Well, we do have another story, Kevin, that's quite closely related to this. And the focus here, and I'll let you introduce, but the focus is talking to people that actually work with these chemistries and take your advice, take your information from them, because they know better than that one lady we won't name who writes for The Guardian all the time.
Well, this was an article written by Jeffrey Cabot, and Dr. Cabot is a expert in cancer epidemiology who has worked with the Albert Einstein School of Medicine and among other institutions. And he is very passionate about data and about risk, and understands risk extremely well. And what he has noticed as a trend is the asymmetrical misrepresentation of data. As much as that we've talked about in the first one by EWG, this also happens by manufacturing risk around things like glyphosate. Other pesticides are good examples, but glyphosate is always the herbicide du jour. And it does mention good old Carrie Gillum and how her articles get some traction and really are misleading in terms of what they say. And he cited the article in The Guardian we talked about back in July, where it said 80% of people have detectable glyphosate in their urine. Okay, two things. One is, okay, that's where you want it. If you're going to detect it, find it in the pee that's outside of your body so it's not influencing anything physiologically. And
Right.
two, the levels of detection were 200 parts per trillion. So the levels of detection was 200 seconds, so about 3 minutes and 32,000 years. And that's how fine this detection is. And does that pose a risk? Not really. But it's when you say 80% of people, it should be 100% of people. But we just don't have detection levels good enough to see it. I mean, to be honest. So bottom line is that what he proposes is that even experts or people who are familiar with this can be fooled. And he really cites an article, a letter that he received from someone who worked for the government in some capacity. I can't remember right off the top of my head, but with Fish and Wildlife or something. And she was an expert in what she did. And she also understood the glyphosate issue very well. And even she was having some concerns that were appropriate. Things like weed resistance and the need to kind of get on increasingly toxic levels of different herbicides, or adding in herbicides that were actually had some toxicity or impact because of resistance to glyphosate. And her whole point was just that she had some concerns, and some that he viewed as valid and some that he didn't. And it just was that back and forth between her and Dr. Cabot that really frames how an expert responds to these things versus how someone like Carrie Gillum does. And it's night and day, how these two different camps address the same common issue.
Yeah, I was just going back through the article again, and it's really fascinating the way she talks about it, because she says, as you mentioned, it was her job to review these chemistries before they could be used. And there's very, very nuanced questions, and we already covered some of them, but but she's talking about specifically like, is this particular version of this product, is it meant for use on the land, or can it be used in an environment that might be somewhat aquatic, right? And she talks about how there were studies done with glyphosate, and there was a surfactant or some kind of additive in the one that they were testing that would kill fish. And this was on the label. The EPA figured this out. They said, don't use this in aquatic environments. It'll kill fish. And so they do this study, and sure enough, the results show that it kills fish. But folks like Carrie Gillum take that and they go, look, this pesticide, it kills marine life. This is terrible. And it's those little subtleties that everyone should be aware of. And if you're honest, you would report this to people. It's just like the glyphosate and the urine thing, without the vital context that's how your body excretes waste and stuff that it doesn't need. That's normal and healthy. In other words, it's just one of those many facts. And this just happens over and over again, Kevin. I don't know what else we can say about it because we've talked about it so many times. I guess we have to keep talking about it until it stops.
Well, just like in the previous article where we urge people to counter the disinformation on the Dirty Dozen, it's important to provide information when you read about glyphosate. And when people make claims, ask them about it. Just ask them to, what do you mean by that? Can you, like someone wrote this week that there is glyphosate in gluten. And I said, can you please elaborate on that? And the guy had no idea. And he made all kinds of, you're paid by Big Ag and all that stuff. And he was just trolling, he just was out, stirring the pot. And it's good to have a little back and forth with them and handle it in a very calm and judicious way, because you look like the good guy and it does help spread good information that way. People who are believing the the false information from people they trust because it comes from their group, from a trusted community, then maybe they start to think twice. And I think the same thing happens here with glyphosate, in that if you are at least honest about relative toxicities and talk about things like aquatic environments. I always mention you don't use it around an aquatic environment because of the surfactants, which are chemistries that coat, like surface tension breaking molecules, like kind of like soap is a good example, where it'll break surface tension. And when surface tension is how certain insects swim or stay on the water, or how fish breathe, or the air exchange through the gills, if they're coated by some sort of surfactant, doesn't work so hot. The skin of different insects, it doesn't have the same gas transfer when it's covered with a surfactant. So the idea of being very cautious around aqueous environments is part of the application requirement for use of a product like glyphosate. And every herbicide has their limitations. That's why when they talk about restricted use herbicides or restricted use chemistries, that means you can only use it if you're trained in using it and if you're a licensed applicator. So it's the articles always kind of point to the outliers, and I'm sure there are people who do misuse these things. I mean, there almost certainly are. But in general, the bottom line is that there can be safe use, and you just have to be extremely nuanced as you begin to look at the literature and understand the conversations that are happening there.
And you practice what you preach, which I always find helpful, So when you talk about engaging people on Twitter, for example, about the research on glyphosate, you actually go do it. And it's really interesting to see the back and forth, because someone will quote an abstract, they'll go to they'll go to PubMed, and then they'll put in, glyphosate death. Then they throw it in Kevin's Twitter timeline. They go, how about this, Mr. Monsanto guy? And, and Kevin just goes into the study and he goes, oh yeah, they shoved rats full of like 100 times, what we're allowed to be exposed to.
Yeah,
and things go wrong when you do that, But they don't know that because they just look at the abstract. The abstract says, potentially elevated toxicity of glyphosate, to whatever, sells in a petri dish.
They identify titles that confirm their bias.
Yeah.
And they don't look at the specifics of the study or the research. The fun one is when you see somebody post something and they haven't looked at it and it's behind a paywall, is to ask them for their copy.
Yeah.
So I don't have access to this. Do you mind if sending me your copy? And then they never do because they don't have one.
Yeah.
And then what always ends up happening is that other scientists end up sending it to you.
Yeah.
It's like, don't do that. I can get it. I'm just pulling his leg, because that's just one way to show how disingenuous it is. But anyway,
Yeah.
there's a lot. It pays to engage. That's the point.
Yeah. Another fun thing to do is you go into the methods section of the paper and you find just some specific detail, like what method did they use to measure glyphosate, or, like what was the metric they used to measure how much was there and so forth. And you just ask them, like, why did they use this kit versus another one? Can you explain exactly why they chose that methodology? They never know. And frankly, sometimes I don't know because I have to go to people like Kevin and say, hey, help me understand this. But that's the difference between being a random person on Twitter and trying to be somewhat responsible with the information that you're handling, But I always find that amusing too, because they don't know the answer to those questions. And if you put that politely in a public forum, you might be able to expose that. Sorry, I just pulled a Marco Rubio and took a big sip of my water, but okay. All right. Last story of the day, talking about Ukraine and the farm to fork going on in Europe, Kevin. So tell us about this.
Yes, so this is actually this was really ironically something I didn't know much about. And first, I've heard of this initiative. So in the EU, I guess someone proposed this. The EU unveiled a farm to fork strategy. And what it was this idea of cutting carbon footprint and doing it by initiating 5 major points, 5 major objectives is have farming be of neutral or positive environmental impact, mitigate climate change, reverse loss of biodiversity, and then ensure food security and nutrition and public health, making sure everyone has access to safe and nutritious food, and preserve affordability of food, and helping promote fair trade. Now, if you were to take all of these elements and say, we need to achieve all of these objectives, it seems like that might be kind of tricky because some of these things are diametrically opposed. And that's really what the article talks about. Is it's great to have pie in the sky ideas, and it's great to be ambitious about curbing loss of biodiversity and having less environmental impact. All of those are great ideas. But the problem is, in order to do that, you're going to have less competitive in the food space. You're going to have more cost, more requirements of inputs, use more land, and ultimately more environmental impact. So it isn't so much about these hard proclamations of we're going to achieve all of these ends. It really is about finding a balance. And where do we do best with preserving biodiversity while still keeping food costs low and still being productive and still being able to grow on limited space, that kind of thing. The big deal is that they've made some mandates that seem almost impossible to achieve. They're talking about cutting chemical pesticides by 50% by 2030 and reducing fertilizer use by 20%. And that's going to be real tricky to still have increases in food while cutting the inputs you need to grow them. Certainly is going to be challenging. And this is all, so that was the big idea. The problem is that when you have a war in Ukraine, and now you have one of the big producers of wheat and grain removed from the equation or have significantly curtailed production, and then Russia being off the table, and they're one of the large fertilizer producers, now you've just lost the input and the output of one of the major parts in the EU. And it kind of gave everybody pause to step back away from this and say, how oblivious is this mandate to cut all of these particular agricultural objectives? And how realistic is it for this farm to fork program to actually flourish?
Yeah, it was a fairy tale before the war broke out. And after the fact, I just don't even how anybody could even seriously propose this. There's just no way it's going to happen. And by the way, this is Stephen Serrier writing in the Genetic Literacy Project. We forgot to mention that earlier. But he makes some interesting points. I think they will be somewhat familiar to our audience, Kevin. But he talks about how when Europe's food production inevitably declines after you force organic farming on growers and you cut their access to inputs like fertilizer and pesticide, you're going to have to export that food production somewhere because you need an increasing amount of food because there's more people, as everyone well knows. So it's going to be developing countries who are going to have to grow some of this stuff, which means their carbon emissions are going to go up. I don't know by how much. I don't know if anyone's exactly studied that yet, but it obviously tends to offset whatever benefit the EU is trying to achieve. And then, of course, you have countries, I think it's primarily sub-Saharan Africa, that are going to experience food shortages because I believe they import a lot of stuff from Europe. So yeah, I mean, this is just a mess, and I don't understand why it's still on the table. I think maybe you got to the heart of it where it's it's ideological. It's like, let's make everything free for everybody for all time, and then that'll solve all our problems. It seems like it's people that are very disconnected from the realities of agriculture, and they don't have any understanding. It just sounds like a good idea. Let's cut chemical use because chemicals are bad. Okay, job well done. I mean, maybe I'm being a little condescending there, but that I can't be that far off. Given the ideas they're putting forward. What do you think about that?
No, it's true. And what's really funny is that my favorite folks in the world, the Greens, who I adore on so many levels, once again make the big mistake of digging in their heels and not finding any middle ground, like saying there must be this hard commitment to organic cultivation and maintaining biodiversity and all the things that they hold true, or all the things they hold important. Where they fail to realize is that you're going to have to triple the land that you're going to need to produce the same amount of food, and that means more inputs, and that means even though they're organic inputs, they still are inputs, and it means you're going to be putting in more copper, and so it's none of this is an easy solution. It also means you forbid the use of genetic engineering, including CRISPR and other types of site-directed nucleases. So now you're not only limiting the tools that would help you get there, but you're also demanding the use of tools that probably won't help you get there. So it really creates a situation that is setting itself up for failure. And again, I love the idea. Let's do things in the name of sustainability, and let's do what's right for the earth, and let's do what's right to cut emissions and all the good things that we can do. But let's do this in a smart way. And let's have all tools on the table. Let's have reasonable milestones, and let's find ways to incorporate new technology so that we can do these things more effectively. And I think that's where this all changes. If we could start incorporating more robotics and more genetic engineering and more careful variable application of fertilizers. Sorry, my brain's blank and it's late. So many things we could do to cut insecticide and herbicide or insecticide and fungicide use, even in organic farms where they use things like copper. There's ways that all that can be curtailed just by incorporating new technologies. So farm to fork should be a little bit different. It shouldn't be a series of mandates of the things we can't do. It should be a series of mandates to spend more money on identifying ways to help do what we do more efficiently. And I really think that's the big trick.
Yeah, it's a good point. Just occurred to me, and there's a handful of folks in the organic or the regenerative movement who are starting to say we should grow genetically engineered crops. And the point that they make that I think a lot of people overlook is that the genetics of the seed you grow have nothing to do with the growing methods in most cases. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but if your concern is using a particular pesticide or whatever, a seed that for whatever reason is better suited to your environment, or it's going to yield more for whatever reason, or it does better with less water or whatever, you could do that and it doesn't affect you. Like, I don't know if you could get organic certification, but you could grow that organically. And that's what those folks are saying, interestingly enough. So even on their own terms, you can embrace technology and you can embrace some of these, more recent developments that are typically termed, big ag or factory farming or whatever, and you're not violating any of your principles. I think that's always really interesting to bring up as well.
Oh, sure. I mean, that's what's so interesting, especially when you start seeing like discussions with what's happening with Mexico. Like they'll say we don't want genetically engineered corn contaminating our corn that's here, and they fail to realize that 34,999 35 thousandths of that corn are absolutely the same. It's only this one little gene that is the genetically engineered event, and that everything else is really going to be a significant departure from what the wild corn is. So even if you have non-genetically engineered corn, you're still having very highly improved hybrids that are completely foreign from what would naturally occur. So it's a really nuanced discussion, and it's sad to see really good ideas and good objectives and good goals that we all can agree on, but really bad ways of getting there, like horrible strategies to get us there. And I think that's the problem. It actually makes us go backwards.
Yeah. Well, Mexico had, at least until recently, they had, authorized use of some biotech seeds. But I know in Peru, for example, there is or was a complete prohibition on biotech crops down there. And so I don't know who figured this out, but some of the farmers went to the market where the imported corn is, and they bought it, and then they just started planting it and like, hey, this works really well. Why does this grow so much better than the crap that we get from the government? And then they started breeding it with local varieties of land races that they had. And then they created this, it's a genetically engineered crop, but it's like this little hybrid, and it has all the traits that they want out of the local corn that they grow, and it's insect resistant. And no one wants to talk about that. The government doesn't want to talk about it. The biotech companies don't want to talk about it. The activists certainly don't want to talk about it. So you have this black market in South America for some of these crops. It's funny, you can't keep the technology away from people who benefit from it, because they recognize that. So
farmers and scientists are innovators, and they'll find a way to get solutions that work. So there you go.
Yeah, everyone does. Just think about caffeine. If the government banned caffeine overnight, would you go, well, okay, no more caffeine? You're like, no, of course not. You would go find a way to get it, and you could do it. Anyways, we don't encourage law breaking, by the way. If any of our critics are watching this, okay, just hypothetical. Stop clutching your pearls.
you give a chimpanzee a hill full of ants, and it'll go find a stick to shove down it to pull the ants out. As primates, we're using that executive function to solve problems, and we don't always have to color within the lines to do it. Good for the farmers who are finding strategies around onerous regulation. I don't want people shouldn't break the law or violate their contracts, all that good stuff, as you say. But it just is another example that they need to have a legal solution that's approved, and then they won't have to go sneaking around. And so there you go.
Well said, as always, Dr. Kevin Folta. Thank you guys, as always, for joining us. This has been episode 210, Science Facts and Fallacies. We'll be back next week with 211. I'm really excited about this progress, Kevin. We're getting up there. These are like big boy adult podcast numbers. So I'm excited to see that. Joe Rogan's still got, 800, 900 episodes on us. We're getting there. It's progress. It's progress.
Well, he does one almost every day. And that kind of jacks your numbers up quicker.
Yeah, if there's a big corporate entity out there that wants to write me a big check, I'll put out an episode of this every day. But
I will too. I'm happy to do it every day. The problem is that doing 2 podcasts a week is really tough.
Yeah.
And just carving out the time to do them. And then the other one, Talking Biotech, is all interviews. Plus I do all the production myself. So, and the website and the whole bit. So it's, I need 4 hours a week to do that and then go home and plant trees. It's a battle royale, but we're getting there.
We'll get through it. We'll get through it.
Always do.
Well, thank you guys. Follow us on Twitter in the interim till the next episode, at Kevin Folta on Twitter, at ACSH.org for my writing, and Genetic Literacy Project. They are at Genetic Literacy. They put this whole thing on. They put the episodes on all the platforms for us. We don't have to think about that part, which is nice. But follow them. Great content. And with that, we will see you guys next time.
Next week.